A millionaire pretends he's still blind, but what he sees changes everything between him and his plus-size caregiver. Just imagine, a man who once had everything, wealth, power, prestige, loses his sight in an accident and ends up living trapped inside his own mansion, isolated from the world and from himself, until a simple woman, rejected by society, crosses his path. She doesn't have luxury, doesn't have beauty by the standards he knew, but she has something he never found in anyone. What begins as a difficult coexistence transforms into something that even James himself couldn't predict. And Wade decides to hide a secret. That's when fate decides to put everything to the test. There was a time when James was the kind of man who made the world revolve around him. Owner of a fortune built on the sweat of many and the ambition of few, he learned early that power and control walked hand in hand. He had everything money could buy: mansions, cars, trips, parties filled with smiling faces, though empty of truth. But what he never realized is that behind all that grandeur, there was a loneliness that followed him like a shadow, until, on a morning that seemed ordinary, a brutal accident ripped him from the top of the world and threw him into a silent abyss. When he woke up, the darkness wasn't just absence of light, it was a reflection of his own soul. The physical blindness was just the final point of an ancient exhaustion, of a heart that had been walking blind for a long time. Now, he found himself locked in his mansion, surrounded by luxury, but imprisoned inside, unable to find purpose even in the simple act of breathing. The days passed as if time had lost its way. James, once feared and respected, now depended on others even to find the way to his own bed. And that consumed him. With each new nurse hired, he tested the limits of human patience. Not out of malice, but out of fear of facing what he really felt. It was easier to push people away with harsh words than to admit he was destroyed. None of them stayed. They left saying he was unbearable, impossible to please. But no one saw what was behind that mask. A man who felt useless, disposable, reduced to a fragile body trapped in a colorless world. At night, the silence was so intense it seemed to scream inside his mind. And he, accustomed to commanding crowds, now conversed only with his own pain. The mansion, once a symbol of power, had become a prison of memories and regrets. Deep down, James believed he was paying some kind of penance, not for the accident itself, but for all the moments when he chose pride over empathy, money over love, status over truth. He was a rich man, but bankrupt inside. And it's curious how life has a habit of bringing down those who forget to look up. It was in this scenario of darkness, bitterness, and silence that fate decided to act in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. A new name was mentioned by the employees. A caregiver different from the others, simple, soft-spoken, unafraid of human pain. James didn't even care at first, believing she would be just another one who would quit before the week was over. Little did he know that this woman, of ordinary appearance and extraordinary heart, would be the only one capable of reigniting the light he believed he had lost forever. It was the arrival of something new, still invisible, but about to transform everything he knew. Grace arrived without making noise, like someone who doesn't want to disturb fate. She was a plus-size woman, with a timid smile and eyes that carried more kindness than she herself imagined she possessed. When the car that brought her stopped in front of the mansion gates, she took a deep breath, clutching between her hands a small worn rosary, symbol of a faith that had resisted life's pains. She came from a completely different reality, simple streets, difficult days, and nights when loneliness was company. But she brought something money couldn't buy: hope. And perhaps that was exactly what fate wanted to teach that man who lived surrounded by gold, but blind to the beauty of what is human. When she entered the house, she felt the weight of silence, that kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from the absence of soul. She was received by cold stares, short instructions, and a warning: he doesn't like anyone. Still, she stayed. In the first meeting, James didn't hide his contempt. It was enough to hear the sound of her heavy steps and the soft tone of her voice to conclude she wasn't the type of caregiver he expected. Another fool who thinks she can fix me, he thought, with the same cynicism he used to push away everyone who tried to get close. Grace, however, didn't react with anger. She just smiled, with one of those smiles that disarm even the hardest hearts. She began to care for him with simple gestures: making coffee, tidying the room, talking softly while dusting the furniture. James pretended indifference, but there was something different about her. It wasn't physical beauty, which he couldn't even see. It was a serenity with which she faced life, even being so often rejected. And this contrast, this glaring difference between one's world and the other's, was the first invisible thread that began to unite them. Little by little, the empire of arrogance that James had built around himself began to show cracks. He tried to treat her as he treated everyone, with coldness, irony, superiority. But Grace responded with kindness. She prayed before meals, sang softly while tidying the house, and was grateful for small things, like the sun coming to the window or the smell of fresh coffee in the morning. James pretended to despise all that, but inside, something bothered him, a strange sensation, almost childish, of being in front of someone who saw the world with the eyes he had lost long before the accident. Grace didn't seem to want anything from him, neither money, nor recognition, nor pity. She just wanted care, and that left him completely disarmed. Without realizing it, James began to listen to the sound of a presence that, even in silence, spoke more than any words, the presence of goodness. James and Grace seemed to belong to different planets. He, accustomed to luxury and the silent solitude of those who live surrounded by riches, she used the simplicity and faith as life's fuel. What for James was excess, for Grace was a distant dream. While he got irritated with the slightest noise, she was enchanted by the song of birds that perched in the mansion gardens. The coexistence between the two began as a silent duel. On one side, the wounded arrogance of a man who lost everything he judged essential. On the other, the sweetness of a woman who never had anything, but still believed in everything. The clash between these two universes was inevitable, and perhaps that was exactly what life wanted. To show that true brightness isn't in gold, but in the soul that knows how to illuminate the darkness. Grace, even without realizing it, began to transform every cold corner of the house into a shelter of hope. Little by little, James's rigidity began to yield, almost without him noticing. It was as if her presence created small cracks through which light could enter. When Grace spoke of her difficult childhood, of her sick mother, or the days when she had to work double to buy her own medicine, James listened silently, not knowing what to say. It was as if her life served as a mirror, revealing how much he had lost his way. That plus-size woman, whom the world insisted on not seeing, showed him what it really meant to be strong. While he saw blindness as punishment, she saw adversity as an invitation to grow. And it was there, between one conversation and another, that a new feeling, at the same time ancient, began to be born. Respect. James, who couldn't stand depending on anyone, began to get used to the sound of her voice, filling the voids of silence. But what's most curious is that this coexistence, so unlikely, wasn't born from love at first sight, but from the sincerity that is rarely found. Grace didn't treat him like a millionaire, nor like a poor soul. She spoke to him as if he were just a man, a human being with pains and flaws. And perhaps that's what unsettled him. She didn't see Mr. James. She saw just James. Each day, the coexistence showed that, despite living at opposite extremes, they both carried the same emptiness, not feeling truly loved. This perception, still silent, planted something inside him, and restlessness that made him begin to desire something he couldn't even name. And it's exactly in this space between pride and gratitude that fate usually prepares the greatest miracles. It was dawn when silence took over the house. The rain fell outside, gentle, and the wind made the curtains dance in slow rhythm. Grace was awake, as she did every night when she felt her heart heavy. She entered James's room, where the soft sound of his breathing mixed with the ticking of the old clock. She stood there for a moment, watching that man who seemed to fight against his own fate even while sleeping. And then, without knowing exactly why, she knelt beside the bed. Her hands trembled slightly as she intertwined her fingers and closed her eyes. She began to pray. She didn't ask for herself, but for him. She asked God to heal him, not just from the blindness of his eyes, but of his soul. The words came out simple, like someone talking to a friend. Lord, give this man back his light, but if not in his eyes, let it be in his heart. While she prayed, something changed in that environment. The cold mansion, until then full of shadows and memories, seemed to breathe. Grace felt a peace she couldn't explain. There was an invisible force there, something greater than herself. She remained silent for long minutes, just feeling the presence of something sacred, as if time itself had stopped to listen. James, still sleeping, moved slightly. A deep sigh escaped from his lips, the kind of sigh that doesn't come from the body, but from the tired soul that finally finds rest. Grace moved, wiped away her tears, and whispered, "The light will return, I know." Then she got up slowly and left, without imagining that simple act of faith would change everything that would follow. The next morning, James woke up different. For an instant, he thought he was dreaming. The brightness came through the cracks in the curtains and drew shadows on the sheet. He blinked once, twice, 3 times, and then realized he could see again. His heart raced, his breath caught, and he brought his hands to his face, trying to understand the impossible. It was real. The man who had given up on everything now found himself before a miracle that science couldn't explain. He remained motionless, looking around, feeling the impact of every detail. The texture of the wood, the discreet shine of the light, life returning to his eyes. And, still without understanding, he felt something stronger than astonishment, gratitude. For the first time in a long time, James cried, not from pain, but from recognition. He knew, deep down, that miracle had a name, and that name was grace. That morning, the sun seemed more alive, more present, as if the universe itself celebrated the miracle that had just happened. James stood for long minutes in front of the window, observing the world as someone who sees it for the first time. The colors moved him, the details enchanted him, and even the distant sound of birds seemed different. It was as if life had returned to pulse inside him, but along with the emotion came also fear. What would happen if everyone discovered he had regained his sight? And even more, what would happen to Grace? She, who was guilty of nothing, would surely be fired, replaced by someone chosen by the board, and he would return to that emptiness that suffocated him so much. It was then that, in an almost childish impulse, James decided to keep it secret. He would pretend to still be blind. He would pretend not to see, not out of cowardice, but because he wanted to see deeper than eyes allowed. In the following days, he lived an intense paradox. He saw everything, but needed to act as if he saw nothing. He watched Grace in silence, studying every gesture, every simple movement that revealed more than 1,000 words. She treated him with the same affection as always, not knowing that now. He followed every step of hers with eyes full of admiration. He noticed the care with which she arranged the flowers, the delicate way she placed the coffee on the table, the habit of looking at the sky through the window before starting the day. There was a purity and grace that completely disarmed him. She didn't pretend, didn't wear masks, didn't expect rewards. Everything she did with love, and James, for the first time, began to understand what that was. He realized he had lived surrounded by people who flattered him, but no one had ever cared for him with such truth. But the decision to hide the miracle began to weigh. At night, lying in his bed, James wondered if he was doing the right thing. He was afraid of losing her, afraid that, upon revealing the truth, Grace would distance herself, thinking he had played with her feelings. And, in a way, that fear made him feel imprisoned again, not by blindness, but by guilt. Even so, he preferred the risk of carrying that secret to risking losing the woman who, without realizing it, was giving him back the will to live. Sometimes he would watch her from afar, while she read or prayed, and felt something inside him bloom, something he couldn't control. It was strange, sweet, and at the same time frightening. He, the man who once had everything and lost everything, now had something new and valuable, a love he still couldn't confess. And it was there, in this mixture of faith, fear, and hope, that their story truly began to change. When James finally decided to look at Grace, it was as if he were seeing the world for the first time. It wasn't just a physical vision that awakened such deep emotions in him, but a perception of every detail that made her unique. She was sitting near the window, the morning light illuminating her soft face, her large eyes full of tenderness, and a timid smile that didn't need makeup or luxury to be charming. For the first time, he could contemplate every gesture, every feature, every small imperfection that, paradoxically, made her perfect in his eyes. James realized that true charm wasn't the outer appearance, but in the authenticity that overflowed from her. It was something no money could buy, something that only revealed itself when you have the sensitivity to see with your heart. He watched her in silence, almost with reverence, seeing how she moved through the house with care and attention. Each gesture of hers carried a story. The strength necessary to endure the rejection that the world imposed, the patience cultivated in the face of difficulties, and the genuine kindness that, though invisible, impacted everyone around. James felt a mixture of admiration and guilt. Admiration for perceiving the greatness that had always been before his eyes, and guilt for having hidden the miracle that now allowed him to contemplate such beauty. For the first time, he understood that his blindness had not been just physical, but also emotional. He, a man accustomed to judging by the exterior, had wasted time ignoring what really mattered. And then, without realizing it, James began to fall in love. Not with a body, not with beauty standards, but with an essence he had never found anywhere. She was a plus-size woman, simple, who never imagined awakening such feelings in someone like him. But the purity, faith, and tenderness she radiated were irresistible. Each look from her, each gesture of care, each small silent prayer seemed to pierce his soul. James understood, in that instant, that his greatest miracle wasn't seeing physically again, but seeing the truth of life, that love doesn't depend on appearance, luxury, or recognition, but on sincerity, dedication, and a heart that gives itself without fear. He finally saw what had always been there, waiting to be noticed. James began to realize slowly that something inside him was transforming in a profound and unexpected way. Each gesture of grace seemed to carry a silent message that pierced his heart like a delicate light, almost timid, but impossible to ignore. He watched how she sang softly while tidying the house, how she folded each piece of clothing with care, how she arranged the books and small objects of the mansion with almost maternal attention. Even the way she prayed before meals and sighed softly at small details, a flower blooming in the garden, the light coming to the window, the smell of fresh coffee, touched James in a way that no wealth, no extravagance or luxury ever achieved. Little by little, he began to realize that his life, once filled with gold and loneliness, was now being illuminated by something that couldn't be bought or measured, the pure and selfless dedication of someone who saw value where he had never seen it. He watched every gesture of grace with almost obsessive attention, but not as a spy, but as someone who rediscovered the world through emotional eyes. Her timid smile, the way she tilted her head when she spoke, the gentle way she moved through the house, all of this awakened him a tenderness he didn't know existed. James, accustomed to judging by what he saw and possessed, began to understand that every human detail, every expression of care, had more power than any figure or title. He found himself reflecting on his entire life, remembering moments when he had superficially judged people who now, if they were before him, would have the same brightness and depth that grace naturally emanated. Little by little, the man who lived closed off in pride and bitterness began to feel his heart opening, responding to the kindness of someone who had nothing to gain but doing good. And it was in this daily coexistence, so unlikely and yet so natural, that James finally understood the true meaning of the miracle unfolding before his eyes. Not the miracle of seeing physically again, but the miracle of seeing love in its purest form. Each gesture of grace, each smile, each sincere word, each silent prayer beside him, made an invisible bridge grow between their hearts. James realized that she not only cared for his body, but touched a part of him that had long been asleep, that had long suffered and hid behind arrogance. The man who had once possessed everything finally understood that he had never had what really mattered, someone capable of seeing his essence and making him see his own too. Each day by her side became a learning experience, an opportunity to renew himself, and he knew, deep down, that this love that arose without warning was more valuable than any fortune that existed in the world. The day began like any other, but for Grace, something seemed different. There was an air of silent tension, almost imperceptible, that left her restless while tidying James's room. She didn't know what to expect, but felt that something was about to happen. It was when she noticed his gaze, fixed, intense, clear, and a feeling of alert ran through her body. She finally understood everything. James was no longer blind. All those weeks, all those gestures, all those prayers she had made without realizing had now been observed, analyzed, and, in a way, manipulated. A deep feeling of betrayal took hold of her. How could he play with something so sacred, so vulnerable? How could someone pretend such an important limitation, just to observe her reaction? Grace's heart hurt more than it ever hurt. She felt humiliated, deceived, as if all the affection, all the care she had offered had been just part of a cold experiment. Her breathing caught, her eyes welled up, and every word she tried to pronounce seemed to escape with the wind. The memories of the small conversations, the contained laughter, the nighttime confidences, everything now seemed tinged with falsehood. And yet, there was something deeper that made her hesitate before walking away. The truth behind his gesture. Despite the crushing disappointment, there was still a hint of doubt. Could there be a reason for such a secret? She wanted to believe, but the pain of deception spoke louder, as if the entire world had conspired against her trust. James, noticing the pain reflected in her eyes, knelt before Grace, with an expression loaded with regret and sincerity. His voice, for the first time, wavered in a human way. He confessed the whole secret, explained the fear of losing her, the reason for having pretended, and how much she had transformed his life. He didn't want to play with feelings. He just feared that, if he told the truth, what he loved most would leave. Each word of his sought to repair the damage, but didn't erase the feeling of betrayal. Grace, crying, felt a mixture of pain and confusion, while trying to digest everything. It was a moment of rupture and revelation, a turning point that neither of them could ignore. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded with emotion, suspense, and a crucial question. Would it be possible to rebuild a trust that had been broken? The silence that hung between James and Grace was heavy, almost suffocating, but loaded with emotion and truth. Her tears flowed slowly, while she tried to process everything. The miracle of sight, the secret, the courage, and above all, his fear of losing her. Each word, he said, each gesture of regret, touched something inside her, though it was difficult to admit at that moment. Grace felt her heart was in conflict, divided between the pain of betrayal and perception that his love had not been false. He knelt before her, begging for understanding, explaining that he didn't want to play with her feelings, but protect what they both began to build. As James spoke, Grace began to see beyond the mistake. She saw the intention behind the gesture, the fear that dominated him, and the undeniable truth that he loved her. Little by little, her heart began to yield gently, as if each word were a breath capable of melting the ice that disappointment had formed. She cried, but also smiled with relief, because she realized that true love was there, strong, intact, ready to flourish despite the obstacles. Forgiveness, in that instant, wasn't just a gesture of mercy, but conscious decision to recognize that the intention and purity of feeling were more important than human failure. And so, between tears, hugs, and words loaded with emotion, Grace forgave James. They recognized together that God had united them to heal wounds that neither could heal alone. That love, which was born from vulnerability and faith, became an indestructible bond, capable of overcoming grudges, fears, and secrets. James, finally, understood that the true miracle wasn't in seeing physically, but in having the opportunity to see the heart of the person who mattered most. Grace, in turn, realized that kindness, faith, and the courage to love without expecting anything in return had the power to transform even the most closed man. And in that moment, love ceased to be just a feeling. It became strength, healing, and promise of a future together. Months later, the mansion that was once just a silent and cold space transformed into a stage of joy and celebration. James and Grace decided to get married in a simple ceremony, surrounded by close friends and family who knew their story. There was no excessive luxury, no unnecessary ostentation, just love, faith, and gratitude overflowing from every detail. The decoration was delicate, flowers scattered throughout every corner, and Grace's smile illuminated the environment in a way that no wealth ever managed to do. James, dressed impeccably, but with more human and humble gaze than ever, walked beside the woman who had changed his life in ways he didn't imagine possible. When it was time for the vows, James took a deep breath and, looking into her eyes, said something that made everyone's heart beat stronger. I pretended to be blind, but it was when I saw you, Grace, that I learned what it really means to see. The phrase wasn't just a confession of love. It was a synthesis of everything they lived together. Fears, miracles, pain, forgiveness, and growth. Grace smiled, tears streaming down her face, feeling that all the prayers, all the moment of care, and all the risks they took had finally been worth it. That moment represented not just a union of two hearts, but the victory of true love over any barrier, whether physical, emotional, or social. And so, between hugs, laughter, and tears of happiness, James and Grace began a new chapter of their lives. No longer a lonely millionaire and a timid caregiver, but two human beings who discovered that true value lies in sincerity, in faith, and in the capacity to love without conditions. Each gesture, each word, and each look became a daily reminder that miracles can happen when you believe in the power of goodness and dedication. And above all, they learned that truly seeing goes far beyond physical vision. It's perceiving the essence of who we have beside us and caring for it with an open heart, as Grace and James finally learned to do. Their story became a living example that love can transform lives and heal even the deepest wounds. The story of James and Grace shows us that the true miracle isn't in recovering physical vision, but in seeing with the heart, recognizing people's essence, and valuing who really matters. How many times do we judge someone by their appearance or circumstances and lose the chance to learn and truly love? It's an invitation to reflect. Have you closed your heart out of fear, pride, or insecurity? Open the eyes of your soul. See with sensitivity. Forgive, value, and transform your relationships. Each gesture of kindness is a step to change not only the life of those you love, but also your own. If this story touched your heart, share it, reflect, and allow the lesson to be applied every day. And to continue learning about moving stories, real miracles, and the power of love, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.